Welcome back to another episode of
Just a Squirrel looking
for a nut,
nut, trying to get out
this
of this rut. Oh, right. That was 90% there. And you know what? One of the things that I would like to do tonight is focus on what we did well. Because half the time when we say this thing, it's a disaster. Why is it that we focus on that and not on what we did well? And that goes as to the whole theme of the show tonight. You know, we were talking a little bit before the show, Oleg, about people focusing on abilities that we do or that we don't have. It might be intellectual abilities. It might be physical abilities. You know, nothing was worse. I don't know about, well, this didn't happen to you. But I will confess this happened to me. In gym class when I was in 5th grade, all that anyone wanted to talk about was how bad I was at kickball. And then when that teacher made us stand up in line, I was the last one picked, maybe the second to last. I considered it a victory if I was second to last. And then everyone laughed and I went home shamefaced because I couldn't do it. Now, we won't talk about the people that were really good at kickball and what happened to them. We'll leave that for a whole other conversation that's off the record. But let's keep it real. There is a lot of focus we have, I believe, as a culture on what people can do, and that leaves people out. Oleg, why don't you start? And then we've got a special guest with us tonight, but after you talk for a second, we'll pull him in because I'm sure he's got lots to say too.
Well, you know, as we were even thinking about this topic, to begin with, one of the first things that came to mind is a quote by Henry Ford. And that is, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you're right. I think in particular, when I think about that quote, it just makes me realize that it is a choice at the end of the day. Now, choosing to focus on the can't do compared to can do, I've realized the same exact thing. In fact, I know that for me, as many people are aware, when I first, not only came to this country, but even the first 12 years of my life, different things that I experienced, I was oftentimes told the same exact thing. You can't do this. You'll never be able to learn that. You will never become this. And I think if anything that I've learned over time is that in many of the situations, in my opinion, why people choose to use such language is because it is a direct reflection of who they are. So I no longer take them as a personal attack, but I rather look at it as a personal reflection or projection that that person posts onto me. So if you were to tell me that, hey, you can't ever be a kickball champion, that is only due to your own perspective and I believe your own limitation. And so at this point forward, I really don't take many of those comments personal anymore. But rather, I try and remind myself that whenever I hear this word, you can't do this or you can't be that, if anything, all it is just one perspective. And it's oftentimes that person's limitation to begin with. And so I feel like that's where I carry that responsibility and understanding that to what degree do I allow someone else's perspective become my reality? To what degree do I allow that person's viewpoint become the only viewpoint through which I'm able to see the world? And that's where I think that's the difference that I choose to decide within my own mind.
You know, in response to that, excuse me, I do want to say that for me, Scott Mason, as a general matter, that's how I choose to approach my life, with an understanding that there are some abilities that I just do not have. I simply do not have the ability to be the world's best chess player. So there are some skills, abilities, and limitations that we all might have that are immutable irrespective of our feeling states about what's possible for us. I would point to that as response number one. But response number two might go as to something a little bit deeper, which is to when and how does the culture within which we operate impose such a blanket view of what one's possibilities are or what possibilities matter, that they actually have the possibility to determine our future irrespective of our ability to manifest it. And with that question in mind, I would like to introduce our special guest tonight. His name is Patrick Bardsley. Patrick, come on out. Patrick, who are you? What do you have to do with anything? What is your function in this world?
Yeah, where am I? I don't know.
Yeah, how do you even exist? Well, we'll have that conversation on another episode. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Patrick, and talk to us about your thoughts on these questions so far after you tell us who you are.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, guys, for having me. I'm a fan of the show, so it's a privilege to be on. So Patrick Bardsley, I'm co-founder and CEO of an organization called Spectrum Designs Foundation. Spectrum Designs is a custom apparel and promotional products printing business, so t-shirts, totes, pens, mugs, all those things. But with the unique social mission of creating jobs for people with developmental disabilities, autism, the neurodiverse population. And the amazing thing is we are a nonprofit as well. So 100% of what we do goes back into the organization. And I think the reason it kind of ties into the topic that we're talking about tonight is with every employee that we have coming to us, at whether they be 16, 18, 21, 35, if they have a developmental disability, they've probably been told at some point in their life, or their parent or their caregiver's been told what they can't do. And we take that and we say, well, we're going to begin with presumed competence. We're going to look at what people can do. And that's a surprisingly refreshing approach, especially when you start applying that to practical tasks in a printing business. And so, I think it's a great topic, and I'm really excited to dive in deeper with you guys. I have a personal story about myself in the print shop that kind of comes to mind immediately. I'm the CEO, and if you can tell, I'm from the UK, but I've been here 10 years, and we bought this big new piece of equipment now because we have a big 8,000 square foot shop, and it's a big automatic printing press. And I said to our COO, Tim, I said, listen, I don't want to be one of those, executives that doesn't know how to do everything in the shop. If I ask someone to clean the floor, I better know how to do it. If I don't, So I said, teach me how to use this print machine. So I roll my sleeves up. I'm ready to get inky and, set the machine up. And he says, okay, first of all, look at the control panel. Here it is. You got head 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever. And when they're green, it means they're on. When they're red, it means they're off. Mm-hmm. I'm colorblind. So immediately I said, well, which one's on and which one's off? And he was like, they're all on. And I said, I can't tell the difference. And he said, I can't teach you this because the machine spins in and spins out. And it's used. I mean, Scott, from your previous life, you will remember that these things could take a finger off. They could really hurt someone.
Absolutely.
If the operator doesn't know. So immediately I realized that this machine was set up for someone who has to not be colorblind. It was just funny. But what happened was I said, okay, well, what can I do on this machine? And they said, well, you can take off. So the machine spins, I take them off, put it on, and I like to think I'm one of the better taker-offers in the print shop. But the point is we didn't just go, sorry, Patrick, you're out. And like I said, I tried and we figured out a way around it. But that's my little kind of funny story. It's kind of ironic that a t-shirt printing guy is colorblind. But hey ho, we all make our way in the world.
It is an interesting point, and it goes as to something that Oleg was saying that I've been thinking about a lot, and maybe is piggybacking on my own statement before you came into the room, which is, why do some things matter and others don't? When I was thinking about this, I'll frame it this way. A little bit earlier this morning, I was thinking, well, maybe some areas where people don't have competence matter more to society because there was way back, in our pre-civilization times, or maybe even in early civilization times, an existential risk to a tribe or to a group of humans in the event that particular lack of ability were allowed to permeate the gene pool. Mm-hmm. And so there may have been discrimination against people that were deemed a threat because of that. However, the more I think about that, the more that sounds like simplistic, kind of BS evolutionary pop psychology that doesn't make sense. And Patrick, that's why I think it's helpful that the idea of color blindness, for instance, is something that you would raise, because color blindness has existed throughout history. It didn't just start with you, as special as you might feel that makes you. My own best friend, actually, well, I won't say that. Well, I knew someone growing up who was colorblind, and honestly, I would never have guessed it. But when you think about it, when we were out there, particularly in agrarian societies or societies that were dependent on picking vegetables and fruits for food, gathering societies, the ability to not see color could be extraordinarily dangerous, because you might not be able to distinguish safe from unsafe food. Similarly, if you were a hunter and could not see color or see color accurately, your ability to be able to discern whether predators were around you in camouflage or whether the prey was there in camouflage or not would be highly compromised. And I've seen, for instance, black and white photographs of tigers in forest. The camouflage looks totally different if you cannot see that color. Yet there has never been this pervasive feeling about the ability to see color or not as a determinant as to whether someone has any purpose in society, as there have been other types of different physical or mental skills or lack thereof. So part of what I'm curious to hear any thinking about is where that might come from. But before I do that, I want to say hello to Tim. I never said can't. Maybe I just said shouldn't. Well, thank you for raising that, because there's a lot of things people shouldn't be doing. Maybe the world would be better if some of them decided they can't do some of that stuff that they're saying they shouldn't. But that's a whole other discussion too.
I didn't know
Patrick, Oleg, what do you think about my question?
I didn't know you had live fact checkers on this show, but like being on a presidential debate. But no, Scott, I think to your point, Scott, I think it's about kind of what it's like we've evolved, I suppose, with the color thing, that it doesn't see, and it seems trivial now, and people almost kind of make a joke about it. And I can't tell you how many people sort of make fun of it. To me personally, as if it's not something it's something that's easy to laugh at. You know, it's not. Whereas, and I tell people all the time, it's a disability, and sometimes it's debilitating. And I know I don't know if it's the case in America, but if you can't be in the Royal Air Force if you're colorblind in the Army, flying planes and be a pilot. But yeah, I don't know why it's been trivialized so much, and I think my instinct is that we've probably evolved enough, to your point, that we're not hunters and gatherers anymore, where we can work around it. And maybe that's a good thing. And maybe there's hope in that, you know, that we work around these other potential ailments that we have, whether it be some kind of developmental disability or that we are able to evolve as a species where we can adapt and accommodate, and which is something that obviously we try and do at Spectrum Designs. But I'm obviously interested to hear what Oleg thinks, of course.
You know, I think for me, the very first thing that came to mind as both of you were sharing this was the word competition. And I think oftentimes, so in my opinion, as everything that I will share for the next hour and a half to 2 hours, I'm a huge believer that when it comes to a lot of these quote unquote, not necessarily disabilities, but I look at them as more so just traits that are unique or characteristics that are unique to who you are as an individual. I've realized that some of the times, especially when I was younger, and probably still to a degree, when I was made fun of for being able to speak another language or not being able to pronounce certain words the same exact way. Same thing happens to kids who I was in the same classroom with who were legally blind or who did not speak English well or who had all these other things that came around it. And what I started to realize was one of the biggest things that was at the core of it all was this word competition. And I think in particular, what I started to focus in more was this aspect of maybe some people thinking that because you are different, therefore you have something over me. And therefore you could possibly take away certain resources and opportunities that I might also have access to. And so I think instead of embracing it through the lens of, oh, okay, Patrick can't see colors the same way that I'm able to. Maybe it's sometimes perceived through the lens of Patrick can take opportunities away from me due to that ability, or due to my inability to not see colors. So I think the more that I think about it, maybe at the same time, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Like you're able to see it, I'm not. But at the same time, who's right and wrong? And I think the answer to that question depends on what is the situation at hand. Like what is required? If it's not required for me to be able to push the start and stop, but rather just stand there and maintain, well, maybe I'm not the best person for a job like that. So I just realized that, and tying it back to Scott's point, the whole concept of who determines what is important and who determines what is valuable. And I think the best way that I could approach and maybe answer part of that question is you. And what I mean is you as the general you. Like you determine what is valuable to you, in my opinion, just like I determine what's valuable to me. It wasn't until recently, within the past however many years, that I started to develop this interest in people and their experiences and their stories and what they learned from it. Prior to that, the interest was not as high. So therefore, it was not as important. So I hope that answers partially of Scott's initial thread on all this, but that's kind of what it makes me think of, is I think one of the reasons why some of these things may not be as welcomed and accepted is due to the fact that it can be seen as a competitive advantage for someone that doesn't have an X, Y, and Z skill or trait or characteristic.
Let me ask you this, though, Oleg, and all questions, by the way, are directed to Patrick. And for those of you who aren't regular viewers of the show, I always say this. We're not necessarily, at least I'm not necessarily, Oleg and I have an ongoing gag about the word we. Like, we hate it. Because who are we to talk about we as in the whole world? Mm-hmm. But so, when you're listening, I sometimes will take a very extreme position here, but it's devil's advocacy position, so that we can discuss the outer limit of the paradigm that we're engaging in, and then narrow down to finesse our thinking with regards to situations that are more and more and more gray. And this is exactly one such situation. The question I have is, to what extent can you make such statements about the meaning or value of an ability or lack thereof if the individual, at least in theory, does not have the capacity to do that? And I'm going to talk about two distinct situations here. One may be that in which they do not have the intellectual capacity to do that. And I say this as someone that worked with a company that had group homes for people that were severely developmentally disabled. Many of them did have the ability to self-actualize and have dreams and ideas for their lives. They might be different, or they might be more limited, or they might be less limited in some ways, or in some respects than any of ours might be, but they were able to do that. Others were nonverbal. And so we'll never know. We have no reason to assume one way or the other that they had the intellectual capacity to think in that sort of abstract fashion, because they didn't have the intellectual capacity to engage in the process of articulating a thought. Mm-hmm. And so that's situation number one, where there is the intellectual lack of capacity, at least theoretically, to be able to conceptualize something. Then two, and this to me is a scarier one and a harder one for us to face if we agree that it exists, where someone does not have the moral or the moral or the emotional capacity to do that, where they are someone who simply lacks a conscience. And so to the extent that self-actualizing and being self-aware is part of the toolbox that we all might have to be able to think more clearly about what our true needs are as individuals and as a society, and how that might or might not include people who are perceived as having different abilities, they don't have the emotional capacity to even begin to think that way. Before you all, and I know you all are going to want to think about that for a second, but I do want to say hello to a very well-respected doctor who is in the house tonight, Veronica LaFaso. Welcome. I think this is your first time joining the show. Veronica is one of the kindest human beings that I have ever met. She is also a very, very well-respected geriatric doctor, and she's spoken on a lot of familial and domestic violence situations that occur in that community. So it is a true privilege to have you in the audience, Veronica. Thank you for your comments, and we want to keep you engaged, and for you and Tim and anyone else who will be watching to be sure to remark about any thoughts you have hearing this. Oleg and Patrick, with that little interlude, talk.
So the first thing that comes to my mind, and I'm curious to hear Patrick's perspective on this as well, but the question that followed the two examples that you brought up, Scott, was where does understanding come from? What does it actually encompass, and what do you need in order to be able to say that you understand someone? I mean, is it a connection? Can it be a connection from heart to heart? Does it have to be a connection from lived experience? For example, if we're having a conversation about some adverse childhood experience that, let's say, neither of you have been able to experience yourselves, do you truly understand at that point, or do you choose to say that you understand because saying otherwise, that you don't understand, could be seen as a sign of disconnect in, I think, many of the cultures? And that is, I think, the first thing that came to mind is, what does understanding even mean, and what are the things that are at the core of that? How do you actually know that you understand someone? Is it the fact that you've lived through it, or can it be something completely different? The other thing that I think came to mind as you were sharing that, Scott, was this concept of being able to connect with people outside of their lived experience. I know that for me, there was one story in particular that comes to mind. So when I came here, I was in 6th grade, and I had the honor to go to this middle school called Ann Arbor Open. Now, I went to the school my first probably 1.5 to 2 years. I didn't speak English well. In fact, I barely spoke any English. But one of the things that I was very proud of myself, in fact, the more that I look back at it now, the feeling hasn't changed, is that I was able to connect with every single student regardless of their background. I'm talking about kids who only sat behind a computer for the entire day. I'm talking about kids who were made fun of every single minute of the time that they were in school. I'm talking about kids who were labeled as troublemakers within that school. What I found was that I was able to somehow find a space within each and every single one of those groups. Now, the question within that is, how was I able to connect with them? Is it because I was able to share part of their experience? Now, there are some of those experiences I haven't lived just yet. You know, the whole concept of being a troublemaker, I was just getting introduced to that. So I didn't really have any concrete lived experience to go off of. But that was kind of the first thing that came to mind, is where does it even begin? What does it actually even mean to have empathy? Patrick, what are your thoughts?
Well, so, I mean, going back to Scott's original kind of question, and I'm with you, Oleg. I mean, that I just thinking about communication. You know, Scott, you had said that, you know, if someone is nonverbal in a practical sense, how do you truly know, you know, what and understand what they're trying to communicate? And I think what the first thing I learned, you know, as a young camp counselor interacting at 18 years old with this population, the first person I met with autism was a nonverbal, pretty profoundly affected young man. But I learned almost immediately that you can communicate in more ways than the spoken language. And I learned that with him, things were an investigation. And as I got to know him better, and Oleg, to your point, I don't know if I could ever truly understand or empathize. But as I got to know him, I learned to follow his mannerisms. I learned to see his eyes change. I learned to see his smile. I learned to understand maybe some of the nonverbal noises he made. And that guided me to an understanding of what his likes and dislikes and wants and needs and desires were. He could never tell me I don't like arts and crafts, let's say, but I could see on his face when we were going to the pool how happy he was. And so I learned to study body language, human behavior in a way that, because it was my only way of understanding him. And by the way, I had no book knowledge at all. I came into this as someone who I'd read The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night Time and play on Broadway, and that was it. I missed the whole week of training, and in some ways I'm thankful for that, because I didn't come in with a kind of, oh, this is why he's got dyspraxia and there's a disconnect between his brain. I just went in being like, I think I can make him talk. That was my I think I can get this guy. I think I can cure this. Which was ludicrous. But I will caution about that, because what happened was, over the years of knowing this young man, I started to think I knew him so well that I could communicate for him. And I'll never forget, it was maybe 10 years after I'd known him. He was 13 when we met, maybe now he's 23, and I still have, his name's Nicholas, I have a relationship with him now. And we would go to a restaurant, and he has a device on his phone where he can communicate, text to speak. So he can type, I want X, Y, and Z. Hello, these kinds of things. And he's very good at it. That's his tongue, that's his voice, that device. And he used to carry a device that's this big. Now it's in his pocket. It's amazing. Anyway, we were in a diner. I'll never forget it. And I've eaten with him a million times. That was one of our favorite things to do. And I sat down with him, and sometimes I'm impatient and I'm tired and I just want to get it through it. So the way it comes over, and normally I say, Nicholas, get your phone, type in a full sentence. I want, and please and thank you to the waiter. And the waiters are always very kind and patient, and they peem over his shoulder and they look and they say, okay, yes, I got it. And then I say what I want. This time I just said, I know what he's going to say. Every single time it's chicken fingers and French fries. Every time. And an apple. That is every time we've ever eaten. 10 years. I know what he's going to say. And today I just said, he wants chicken fingers and French fries. The waiter said, great. I looked down at his phone and he'd written, I want peanut butter and jelly. And I was like, oh my God. I ran after the waiter. I said, I'm sorry. Look at his phone. He wants something different. And I said to myself, that was the trap I fell into. And I thought I knew, and I was speaking for him. And I said to him, I'm so sorry. I just apologized. I was like, and thank God he had that device, because he would have got you and he would have eaten it, but that's not what he wanted. Right. And my own kind of just laziness, arrogance, whatever you want, impatience, got the better of me. And I made an assumption based on his wants and desires. And thankfully he was able to communicate that in a different way that wasn't verbally. But to your point, Oleg, like, how do you ever truly understand anyone? Yeah. And the empathy is a hard one too. And I like to think in my 10, 15 years of working with this population, I have a great deal of it, but I would never claim to be an authentic voice of the disabled community. I'm a big believer in nothing about us without us. And so, for me, that was a lesson early on that I'll never forget. And I always said, this young man and all the individuals I work with have always taught me more than I could ever teach them. It's so true, Scott. The communication has to be, if it's not there verbally, you have to figure out another way. And we've been good at that as technology's evolved. I'm not sure Steve Jobs ever thought that he would, create a product that would change the lives of people with disabilities and give them ability to communicate. But before that, it was really challenging. So yeah, that's the story that stays with me to this day.
How did the two of you, and this is a question to either of you, but in regard to this whole concept, maybe even outside of someone who has what are perceived to be disabilities in whatever the form may be, but how do you personally draw the line between pity and empowerment?
Pity, to me, involves condescension if it is directed towards another person. Pity, to me, well, it depends on the nature and the origin of the reason why I'm pitying someone.
Mm-hmm.
Pity has a negative taint as a word in our modern culture. I suspect, although I don't know for sure, that it comes from some of the situations in which it arose. For instance, you would read about it in medieval literature or literature from earlier than that, where a king would be sitting on his throne, usually a male, and some horrible atrocity might be about to occur, or some horrible thing may have happened to a peasant, let's say, or a common person. And the ruler acts in kindness out of pity for the person. That distance that allows then the ruler to be able to act to help out a person who is in dire need. And by the way, that ruler oftentimes is a deity. God pitied the Israelites, so he helped them escape from slavery in Egypt. The gods pitied such and such mortal, and so they, turned them into a tree so they wouldn't have to suffer anymore. Although that, who knows as to whether that really was the nicest outcome possible. But, that's the sort of thing. So there's this hierarchical arrangement that is usually, at least as I understand it, associated with the notion of pity that people resist, because we, in a more egalitarian society, one that's rejected things, at least one that has ostensibly rejected things like monarchy. And I understand, right, England still has a monarchy, for instance, Patrick, but still, right, politically, it's not like the queen just, tosses around her scepter and people are executed the next day. Right. And it is considered a democratic society. Yep. And or republic. Is it a republic? It's a republic, right?
Parliamentary.
A parliamentary. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
See, I don't know. I don't know. Pity me. But anyway, that sort of hierarchical difference underlying the actor that is able to take the action against someone who is helpless, to me, underscores and is the origin of a lot of the taint associated with the word pity. It disempowers. However, and I say this with a lot of passion, we happen to be, as we have moved towards a more egalitarian society, and the one that recognizes as unjust non-meritocracy-based inequalities, into a situation where at least arguably people can gain power or at least social currency by claiming to be in a position of disadvantage. And there are some people both in the political or cultural sphere, but we'll talk here about the personal sphere, who actually use the emotions that pity can evoke in someone to gain power. Now, there is a certain relative I had. I won't say who this relative of mine was, although I know they're not listening. But this particular relative loved to be pitied. Look at me. Look at what they've done to poor, helpless little me. And then everyone would drop what they're doing and surround this person and shower them with love and attention and praise and sort of, prop them up, and then cast as a villain the person that was allegedly, causing the injury that would lead to the pity. So I would say that this is something that has a double-edged sword, but even that, it's a person gaining power. Maybe that's the difference between, or maybe it's not a difference, but it explains to me the relationship. Pity is rooted in an unequal power dynamic, whereas empowerment, there may be a power dynamic, but us as agents in the world have the ability to impact that as we So please.
So-
What do either of you see when you first look at a person?
Patrick, answer that one. Because I'll answer honestly, and then I'll be banished from the United States forever.
I had an answer for the pity and the empowerment. That one at me. Well, I mean, just for me again, because we talk about this all the time. Simply, pity is a handout, empowerment is a hand up. And that's what we talk about at Spectrum Designs all the time. Because we're trying to give people a hand up. We're not trying, we're trying to help them. What do I see when I see a person? It's so funny because Scott and I have been having conversations, and I'm going to dodge the question slightly, but it will maybe answer. Scott opened my eyes to a term I'd never heard before, which was the commodification of people. And it did make me turn around for a minute and say, because my whole being, my whole ethos is create jobs for people, have people working, have people do things, right? And then create jobs for those who are underserved and then Scott throws the commodification of people at me, and all of a sudden I'm like, am I commodifying people? Am I commodifying a disabled population? But so my original answer before Scott had maybe talked to me about that would have been opportunity. When I first see someone, would have been competence, especially if it was someone who, as I started off saying, may have been doubted or underestimated or undervalued. So now Scott's got that in there. I think for me it's now I start thinking about ways that they will find purpose and happiness, and not that I want to give that to them, but I don't know, I'm so passionate about what that's done for me, that I want to make sure that whatever they're doing, whatever my interaction is with them, that it's somehow leading them towards something that makes them happy and makes them feel purpose. Either way, I think purpose tends to breed happiness, but a joke and a nice word can do it too. But yeah, I think that's what I'm looking at when I first see someone is that. But I'm sure you guys have got amazing answers to that.
Do you find that? And I'll stop with the 20 questions after this, but I'm just I'm just genuinely curious as both of you are sharing this. But do you find that depending on the person's circumstances and the times where they've been told that you can't do this, you can't become that, does that intensify your own passion for wanting to help that person succeed and achieve X, Y, and Z? Like, do you use those words as fuel?
Yeah, for me, absolutely. I love, like, we were talking about this morning, and Tim, I think, who's still there, had talked to our staff, and he told the story, and maybe you guys have heard it, of when JFK toured NASA and he met a janitor, and the janitor, and he asked the janitor, what do you do here? And he said, I put a man on the moon, and then carried on sweeping the floor. And that was that employee buy-in, and it's a famous story, and he was talking to our staff about it, and he was like, you're not just screen printers, you're not just artists, or graphic designers, or whatever position you're in, or social media managers. You're helping create jobs for people with disabilities. And then we took it a step further and said, you're helping people outside of this community see the capabilities of this group, see a world. Like, our vision is that there's a world that only sees ability, and that we kind of move away from disability in some way. So yeah, those words really, really fuel us. It's what really gets us out of bed in the morning. It fires our team up to say, hey, when we put a product out there, it might just be a product, it might just be a t-shirt, but what it represents is something so much bigger than that. It's life-changing. It's thought-changing. I can't tell you how many times people will say, hey, I would love to order from you guys, but is it going to be crooked? Or, are you going to be more, is it going to get done in time? I know you've got this great mission, I want to help the kids, but, and that fuels us to be like, put that relic out into the world of capabilities of what someone can do. It drives us crazy, but it also drives us to and be disruptors.
I have a story that might answer this in a different way. But before I say that, Oleg, you asked earlier, what is empathy?
Mm-hmm.
To me, when I heard that story, I felt what I believe empathy is. And that is an emotional reaction that is, to me, connecting with the meaning that connects that story to a place in my heart. Not even in my mind, but in my heart. There was a part of me that when I heard that, I got very emotional inside. I was very affected by it in a way that's uncontrollable to me. And that, to me, that uncontrollable emotion that you feel when something affects you is the emotion of empathy. It's not sympathy. It's not pity. I'm not looking down from a hierarchical position. If anything, I'm looking up in a truly connected way to the person that is, to the people that were the subjects of that story. Now, going back to what I was going to say a minute ago, I completely forgot because I went on that little tangent, but I will get back to you as soon as I remember. And that's one of the things about being live. We have to be able to cover up, but in the interest of authenticity, I'll say I just plain forgot. You were asking, Oleg, what do you think of when I know exactly what it was.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Patrick, you might have thoughts about this too. So I was last year in the very early part of the year before, stepping out of the house became something that we just didn't do. I went to a Toastmasters group that was not my home group. And I gave a speech at that. And then I talked to people beforehand and afterwards. And one of them was a woman whose descent at some point or another in time was African, but was from the UK. And we talked and I chatted with her. She was a graphic designer, so we had a little bit in common because of some common historical professional overlap. And then later, someone in the group who had brought her as a guest emailed me and said she really enjoyed talking to you and wanted to know if you would talk to her again. So I did. And when I talked to her, I said, why did you want to talk to me again? I mean, I'm compelling and all that, but, seriously. And she said, as a woman of African descent in Britain, she never felt that she was anything other than just another woman just walking around. But in America, even in New York City, which is easily the most cosmopolitan place in the entire country, she felt very aware of her skin color in a way that she had never imagined was possible until she came to this country. And then she said something very profound to me. She said, Scott, you were the first person since I've been in New York City who saw me. I could see it in your eyes. I could feel it in the way you spoke to me. I felt like I was back in England again. I felt as though I was seen as a human being. And so when you ask, Oleg, what I see,
Mm-hmm.
or what we see when we see other human beings, it's funny, before that incident happened, I would likely have said something superficial like, oh, I see the hair and the body shape and the gender and all of that sort of stuff. And it may even be politically incorrect to say otherwise. And I'm not going to say I ignore those things or that I don't notice things like race or gender or clothes or hair or any weird, unshaved ears or things like that, or hair growing out of your ears or things like that. But on some level, I have always felt, and that story validated, that I do see, not we, I see what I believe to be something of that person's spirit.
Mm-hmm.
What that is, I don't understand. I've always been told that I can relate to a wide variety of people and connect to them. And I genuinely do feel comfortable around a wide variety of people, although not everyone. That's my response. But Oleg, what do you think? You can't ask that sort of question. You just get away with it.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. That's slinky. Don't do that.
I think for me, so there are a couple of things that stood out from what both of you shared. The first is this whole concept. When I personally look at someone, what I choose to acknowledge is the being, however that being shows up, whoever they are. So as you mentioned, it's not that I don't see any of the other things. I do see all of those things. It's more so, how do I choose to accept them into my life? Do I choose to look at the difference in the color of their skin or color of hair or the dress style or whatever it is, and use those as ways to differentiate? Look at them as, oh, this person is trying to be better than I am, or do I accept that person for who they are? And that's what I've started to do from probably relatively young age. Is one of the biggest reasons why I was able to connect with many of those kids in middle school, is because I was able to see the people for who they were. I will also say that I think another reason why I was able to see people through those particular circumstances is because of my own past. I think I'm not going to speak for all, because I'm in no position to do that, but I'll say from my particular lens, when I started to understand my own experiences, and there was a book that I recently read that once again was a great reminder for me, called Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins, who is former Marine, I believe. But anyway, there's a chapter in that book where there's actually a sentence in that book that shifted my perspective completely. And it revolves around judgment. He said, why would I want to judge anyone if I remember what it was like to be judged myself? And I think it's the same exact thing that applies for me when I choose to look at other people. Why would I try and make immediate judgments when I still remember the feeling of what it was like to be judged? And I'm not talking about being judged 10 or 15, 16 years ago. I'm talking about possibly being judged half an hour ago, walking into a grocery store. As many of the people who live in Texas right now, we're going through something rather unusual. I mean, not having power in certain areas, water. Some people have gone without 2 basic needs, basic resources, and they're having to survive. They've been doing this for 4 days. And so I think about those things, and even for the people that choose to go into, the grocery stores and take as many of the resources they can, I really try not to judge, to be honest with you, because I think in judging, I'm putting myself as something better or higher than that individual, when the reality of the matter is we're just 2 people operating from 2 different perspectives. That's it. And I think that's the same exact thing that connects to me and connects me to Patrick's story as well, is just this understanding that people have their own circumstances, people have their own stories, people have their own ways of going through whatever it is that they're going through. And if there's anything that I could do, it is to meet them where they're at and not put any specific label on their experience, but rather look at them as this whole being instead of looking at them through just one particular lens.
Tim has a lengthy but very worthwhile story that, in my opinion, illuminates that point. And I am curious, and Tim, Veronica, anyone else who is listening or watching, I would love to hear your thoughts about this as well. So please type them in, which is at the end of this story, the individuals that may have judged the employees of Spectrum because of the perceived disability reframed the perception of those individuals based on the experience they had, which was to some extent, I assume, and I could be wrong about this, impacted by the positivity of the overall experience and or familiarity. And I would be curious as to know any thoughts that people might have. Patrick, maybe I'll start with you as to what the tipping point for that is.
For that change, for that transformation?
Yeah.
I think it's got to be a combination of things. It starts with awareness. It then evolves into patterns of thoughts changing. It advocacy is important. People have to be able to stand up and advocate, even if those don't, especially for those who don't have a voice. And then it's interesting that this is brought up, because we're having this internal discussion, and this is you two in particular are the perfect people to bring this up to, is we're evolving in the disability autism community to the term neurodiversity. And I would love your help to kind of figure out the direction here, because all of us on this program are neurodiverse. We all have different brains. We all have different skill sets. We all have different experiences. No two brains are the same. We are neurodiverse. So we talk about neurodiversity at Spectrum Designs. We have a neurodiverse workforce. It's not really in the mainstream vernacular right now. Neurotypical tends to be, though we don't have a word for I guess we say non-neurotypical. So what do you guys, I guess my question to you, and based off of Tim's story, how do you guys feel about the term neurodiversity? And then if you are someone who has the label or uses the term disability, does that then kind of blend you in with everyone else? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? How do you tell the Spectrum Design story without the word disability or without the word autism, or without, because otherwise you're a group of neurodiverse people working along printing t-shirts, right? So I would love to know what you guys think about that. And that's because that's where our community is going. And if that's normally where it is now, within a few months, a few years, that will be the main term. Just like things like mental retardation, have gone away. Moron was a term, idiot savant was another term that are now derogatory. Perhaps, disability might become derogatory, or it already can be used in that way. So what do you guys think about neurodiversity as a term, as a catch-all for everyone? Can it be treated the same way as gender diversity or ethnic diversity? I would love to get your insight, because you guys, while I think you're compassionate and have empathy for this community, maybe you're not in it in the same way that myself and Tim, our team are. So what do you guys think?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, there are a couple of things that come to mind as I think about this. First is having a nonprofit of my own called Overcoming Odds. I think it's a similar thing. And what I mean by that thing being it is conversations with people who are looking to support a particular mission at hand. Oftentimes what I've realized is that unless a label or a term, as you described, disability or underserved, underrepresented, is somehow included within the description or presentation of one's mission, it oftentimes, in my experience, doesn't connect with the individual's dollars. Now you think about it through the lens of, okay, what is it that the individual is actually supporting? Is the individual supporting the development of a human being, regardless of what the label or experience may be? Or is there an additional layer, such as underrepresented or underserved, that it communicates to that person? And that's why I was asking both of you that question of what's the difference between pity and empowerment. Because here's the thing. What I've realized was, however many years ago, when I started to dive in much of this quote unquote personal development work, and I started to reframe and look at my circumstances different, the last thing that I personally wanted to be labeled was any of those terms. Orphan, disabled, adopted, whatever it was. And the reason why is because of all the stigma that all those terms carried already. And so the only way in my mind was to break away from the stigmas that each one of those labels carried, was to not be labeled to begin with. And that is, I think, is an interesting question for me to explore as I even build and continue to work on a lot of this, is to what degree are those specific terms necessary? Are they necessary because otherwise you can't connect an emotional connection? And why can't you simply express the fact that your foundation is about helping other people who face difficult circumstances in life? Boom, that's it. Why does it have to be any additional verbiage that somehow makes it, quote unquote, more credible than some of the other efforts? That's something that I know Scott has worked in this field as well, and I'm sure he has his own perspectives on it. But I know that personally speaking, over time, yes, I've chosen to embrace many of those labels as part of my identity. But I will say that one of the reasons why I don't choose to identify myself with those from the get-go, but rather view myself and present myself as a human being, is because of all the stigma that those terms carry. And I think if I were to continue to, this is once again my opinion of it, but if I were to continue to label myself as those things, I think in a way, it's almost like a mental prison I'm creating for myself. So then how can you ever break away from a label if all you're continuing to tell is that you are X, Y, and Z? Scott?
It raises a lot of provocative questions in me. And Patrick, I'm so glad you asked that, and can't wait to hear your own thoughts about this too, in response to what we have to say. You know, the most dramatic and impactful term that I can relate to that may be a parallel to this is my own status as a gay man, or ostensibly gay. And I say that because, you know, it's one of those things where part of me is like, I'm a human. I'm a people person. And I've been also told by various people, I'm not, you know, more or less in different sorts of ways, I'm not really gay. I'm not gay enough. Yet at other times I've been told, you're gay. whether you look that way or act that way or not, you're gay, make no mistake. And you will pay a price for that. And part of me, when you say you learn to embrace it, Oleg, I have some back and forth about that. I learned to embrace it. Perhaps that's technically what's happened, but it's to some extent pragmatism. I walk into the room with my spouse. He's a male. If I sit and just say, oh, you know, I don't want to be in a mental prison, you know, or something like that. And I don't mean to scoff at or diminish anything that anyone is saying. The reality is that no matter how PC we are, no matter how polite our societies are in, y'all notice that. You all aren't like, oh, that was just nothing. I mean, seriously. I'm very well aware of that. And that is part of being human. We're biologically wired to observe categories of things, or to develop categories for things, and then to act accordingly. And again, that has an evolutionary origin, and we would be completely foolish to lose it if we're not able to, for instance, distinguish between a rock on a beach and a rock coming from the sky that's the size of a planetoid. Our species could be extinct like that. So our ability to make these distinctions and to note them is of significance, and it's actually a part of emotional intelligence. What we do with it and how we choose to respond to that is one thing, but I cannot get to the point where I feel like could be realistically in denial about the fact that people notice, even if they don't look at me and say, oh, I looked at him for 2 seconds, I know that guy is gay. There are people who are LGBTQ who people look at them and that's the first thing that they think. That person is gay. And that impacts how they are treated in the world, even if it's on a subconscious way. And it could also deprive them of the things that perhaps make them unique and special in a positive way. The existence of a stigma that Patrick, you were talking about, or Oleg, you were talking about, that may drive our resistance to this is, to me, again, we could really go into an abstract conversation about, and there's merit to that maybe in a different situation, as to whether those stigmas are real or not, or whether those stigmas only exist to the extent that we allow them to exist. But let's face it, people get fired because of their race all the time. So they could be, or their gender, or their sexual orientation, or their place on the neurodiverse spectrum. And to sit and say, well, don't let it affect you and you can't let other people define you, is a hard thing for someone to take if you just got a pink slip and are suddenly on the curb without any paycheck tomorrow. And so that's why this raises a lot of complexity to me. There is an aspirational element to this. I would love for us to live in a society in which neurodiversity is something at best we just sort of comment and ignore. But let's be real. We're not hardwired that way. We notice our differences.
Yeah.
I'll give a very dramatic and humorous example. Patrick, forgive me if I'm busting you out on something, but it's something we can get a chuckle about because it was public. Patrick and I got to know each other through a class. And there was a certain teacher in this class that kept finding ways to mention how attractive Patrick looked and his accent. And that was funny and it was a joke, but it only was funny and a joke because we all knew, we all could observe how Patrick looks and we all could hear his accent. And we didn't just walk around saying, oh, that's just Patrick's unique little way of talking. No different than Oleg's or Scott's. It's an accent. And we all know that. And so this is something where I feel like there are real limitations in the, and I will say this because as someone that's in this space, in the personal development space, there are limitations as to its reach and force, so long as it doesn't acknowledge some of the actual or diminishes some of the actual realities that people live in. There are not laws against certain behaviors if they don't exist. And so that's my general response. Pauline, the conversation maker, I do want to welcome you to the show. Thank you very much. And that's a very different perspective, actually.
Only problems if we use labels to define
Yeah.
categories.
So she's suggesting that rather than being neutral, these changes are all viewed as different awesome things that we notice about each other, sort of maybe not focusing on the negative.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, guys. What do I do? It's like, all right, where do we go? We talked. You guys both related it to your own personal feelings of being labeled in some way, right? And I sit here and I think sometimes it's important for me to go to the kind of cone of privilege, right? And go, I'm a cisgender white male middle class whose parents, I was two parents in the household, master's degree, all those things that make it really hard for me to know what it's like I'm kind of top of the privileged food chain, if that is a thing. Like, I don't see a police car drive by and I say, oh, that's good, they're here, and I there's a lot of things that are really hard for me to empathize with because of who I am. So that's a difficult thing, which means like sometimes I feel like I have to work harder at it to check that privilege, and to go, hey, if we're going to call it privilege. As regards to labels and it's fascinating and trying to get towards this kind of neurodiverse utopia, but I agree there's completely a place for it based on what Scott was saying with regards to a history of discrimination and that's still going on, right? We know that's still going on with certain movements. I mean, 2020 taught us that. Right now, and again, I'm going to plug back into the disability community because that's what I know best. I walk around the streets and I cross the street and I have to step over on a sidewalk. I have to step over a big load of snow and slush, and I look at it and it's this thin, and I say, how does someone with a disability cross the street right now in New York, in Austin? How does someone in a wheelchair cross the street? They can't. I mean, forget the pandemic. Every time it snows, every winter in the history in the Northeast and in Texas, they've not been able to go outside for periods of time because you can't get across the street. And I said this today to our chief of staff, where I was lamenting that and saying, that's important. And she said, well, half the subway stations in New York City don't have elevators. And guess what? A lot of those people were the ones who were cleaning the transit services during the pandemic, performing essential work, people with disabilities. So in that instance, the labels are very important because then, to Scott's point, they can be used. They provide a voice and a direction of change, and of saying, hey, this group here, they need our help, they need our advocacy, or we should join them in their advocacy. And okay, we don't have to be a member of that group, but we do have to Scott's point, be able to put some kind of definition or and we other, right? And that's even back to the tribal days. That's a different tribe to mine, right? That's human nature. We are hardwired that way. But I think what we need to get to is to a place of the goal should be, we see everyone based on their own amazing, unique abilities, and that we don't, that we are all diverse in that sense, and we embrace it and accept it. But it's hard to imagine a world where those labels and those definitions don't have some purpose, because unfortunately I think human nature is to do that, and we're hardwired that way, and it's the only way to group and affect real change in a lot of, and we saw that with the the BLM movement. It needed a name, it needed it, and sure, there's people who have issues with that movement, but it's been the strongest since it got a name, since it got a, it's been rise ups before, even back for years. And, I've been in this country 10 years, but people like, I remember Rodney King in, which was what, 40 something years ago,
at least.
The movement got a name, and suddenly, and there was some horrible instances that sparked it, but it doesn't seem to be slowing. And it's gone global. Like in the UK, soccer players and sports people have Black Lives Matter on their jerseys. They kneel before each game. And that started in the United States. And so I think if we tried to take that away at this point and say, well, everyone should be seen as equal and across, and of course that's what we all want, but that's just not the reality.
Richard Marks, one of our regular contributors, just joined the house. Richard, first of all, it's good to see you, and I hope everything is going well with you. Richard says human beings make things. Aren't we defined by what we make? Are we? What if
I would say so.
What if
I would say
something?
To a degree. I would say to a degree that's true, because I believe. So one of the things that I do believe in is I believe words alone can either create or break someone else's world, if not my own. And so I think to a degree, having the ability to make certain things, maybe I am defined by those things. That is a really interesting question, though, because I guess you could also say that there are certain components that you're not. Because yes, I might be thinking certain things and doing certain things from my own lens and perspective, But how I choose to collaborate with you and how we choose to create a world right now between the three of us, I can't control the contributions that come from you. I can't control whether or not I'm going to be accepted. I can't control whether or not my thoughts are going to be rejected. So to a degree, I would say maybe I am defined by some of those things that I choose to create. But at the same time, like, that's a really complex thing because there's so many other characters that are involved in the collective creation of the world. Even the whole conversation that we're having about this whole concept of disability versus ability, or even community, because much of that depends on who is in the conversation. I mean, I may view difference through one lens, and the two of you may view difference through a completely different lens.
If we are defined by what we make, though, what if you're in a coma? Are you not human then?
Well, what does it mean to be a human then? What does it mean to be a human to begin with, I guess?
Yeah. To me, that's an easy answer. It means you are part of on one level. It means you are part of the species Homo sapiens, and you can mate with other Homo sapiens, or at least in theory you can, and produce Homo sapiens offspring.
Right. And
to me, that's all that it is to be human.
Right. And you have sentience. You're aware of your own death or eventual death, I suppose, right?
Maybe not. If you're a child who's under the age of 3, you're still human.
Good point. I think it's interesting about making things because, immediately I, as maybe a bit of a pragmatist, go, well, like making a tool or making something. But then I guess if you take it deeper and say, you're making friends, you make mistakes, you make connections, you make memories, right? Is that what we're talking about here?
Oh, maybe.
But then here's the other question to it all, done. Even in regard to Scott's point, coma. Who's to say that due to your connection, I apologize for all the dog barking if you're able to see hear it in the background. This is called dealing with the circumstances at hand. But outside of that, who is to say that if you were to be in a coma, that it wasn't somehow that you didn't have a role in it?
Well, and that may be related to what Richard Marx said about what he believes a coma is. I did read a recent account of someone that was in a coma. Now, I've read some accounts where they've been like, it's just like sort of being in a black void, sort of like being in anesthesia or something, or they don't have a memory of it. But I did read an account where a person basically said that it was like being in a hellish nightmare for like years and years. It sounded so horrible that and then when they finally came out of it, they felt like they had literally been released from an eternity of just unimaginable, surreal, but seemingly real, nightmarish existences. So, even in that situation, right, they might be creating something. And the idea of a coma, I said that flippantly, but maybe it was a little bit more flip even than I intended, because we may or may not, for instance, be creating when we are in anesthesia, but we're still human.
What about other circumstances? Let's say you're texting and driving and you get in a car wreck. Technically, you created that.
That's true. You're living out the consequences. Richard says, and I want to be clear about this, all that is to be human is not procreation. I don't know if you interpreted what I was saying that way. So I'm glad you raised that, Richard, because that was not what I meant. What I meant was that the biological capacity to, if assuming you don't have any damage to your reproductive organs or your instincts, you should be able to, at least in theory, procreate with another member of the homo, right? The way, if you are part of what distinguishes a horse and a zebra, is that if they reproduce, the offspring will not be a horse or a zebra. It just won't happen. And so that's what distinguishes them as a species. And I was just talking about this as a matter of speciation. Now, what Richard said next, the human spirit. That is a more interesting question. Does that define us as humans or not? I will challenge that on two fronts. First of all, many people do not believe that we have spirits at all. I was just in a meeting last night with someone. He's like, we're just shells. We think we have spirits because we need to, but when we're over, we're gone. And who are really any of us to say whether he's right or wrong? We don't have a definitive answer to that. Number two, let's say we all do have something, or most of us have something that we would call a soul or a spirit. How do we know? We've discussed this before. How do we know that everyone has it? What makes us think that we do, that everyone does? A psychopath who's murdered 1 million people, one could argue is a damaged soul. One could also argue that they happen to be a human that was born without one. How do we know? And simply saying, to me, I will argue this, simply saying, well, we all do, we must, isn't good enough. It's not good enough. We need, I need something more than that. OMG, Richard says, I don't know what the OMG was about. You've got to explain. You've got us hooked. Your comments, the show would not be the same without them. So please explain that one a little bit more. What did I say that took away my humanity? Oleg, Patrick, I've been talking too much.
I would just, on the human spirit side, I remember when I was a young kid asking my older brother, who I guess now would be deemed an atheist or agnostic, well, what happens when you die? You go to heaven, you go to, I'm probably like 8 years old. And he explained to me that, that the spirit, he was like, there's no such thing as heaven and hell, blah, blah, blah. But he's like, the spirit lives on in my memories of you, in everyone's memories of you, or my spirit when I die will live on in you. And the stories you'll tell, your children or your friends about me. And that's the spirit, is, I guess it's in the memories and in the impact that you had on someone. That's how I see it, based on kind of that experience and thinking about it and having experienced loss of someone who's no longer here, and that shell has gone, and what are we left with? And we just call it, to bring back to labeling, we call it a spirit, but really it's the memories and the impact that we have, and then how that person helped you live your life or impacted and changed the direction of your life beyond if you hadn't met them, and how they changed your trajectory and everything else. That to me is the spirit, and that they live on in you, their influence on you.
I would say that's very similar. I mean, that was a perfect summary of how I would describe someone else, is the fact I more so look at the lessons that they've taught me and the lessons that they've helped me learn throughout my life. And I think that in a way is a continuation of their life after they're no longer here in the physical form. Outside of that, I mean, it's a great question. It's a loaded question as far as how do you truly know that you're connected to anything of a higher realm of consciousness? Or is it just simply a thought that one makes up? I have no way of knowing. I think if there's anything that I've learned over time is, in my opinion, whatever it is that I choose to believe to be true, that's the truth. And the truth will evolve due to my level of awareness, my knowledge. I think that's the other thing that I've tried to implement as often as I can, is whatever it is that I choose to believe, whatever ideologies or whatever the thinking process that I go by now, I also understand that 5 or 6 or maybe 10 years down the road, they may not be the same, but that's okay. It's okay to change. It's okay to evolve. It's okay to not think the same way that I used to when I was 5 years old, and 10, 15, 20, and 25, all these other increments. So I think to a degree, how do you know? I don't know. That is a really good question. I think if there's anything, it's more maybe a personal connection and whatever it is that you choose to attach meaning to it. I mean, for some people, it could be a connection through a form of meditation. Now, because I'm not in their body and I'm not in their head when they're meditating, I have no way of knowing what they're experiencing. And then the other question is this: to what degree can you actually communicate to someone what you believe you know about your connection to spirit? And then to what degree does language has its own limitations?
Richard Marx. I'll slide out of this one by turning back to Richard Marx. My little techniques have just been exposed. All right. I actually not though, really. Richard's remark is relevant. I think that we are spirit. That's Richard, that's why we love you on the show, because you're deep. You really are. So, and I say that with true appreciation.
What does that mean then? So I know that probably somehow relates to this whole topic of we are one. But what does that even mean?
Now, I take we are one again, and maybe I'm not being even honest with myself, and to some extent, I don't think I am being honest with myself when I'm saying this, but this is what my conscious mind thinks, which is we are one. It actually goes back to what I mentioned earlier, the biological speciation. We are one biological species, race notwithstanding, gender, sexual orientation, intellectual ability, or physical ability, or injuries, or different body formations, different size, different body types, different configurations of our features, all of those notwithstanding. When I say, at least on a conscious level, and again, I can and accept challenge to this, that we are one, I view us as the same species, and with the same species, these superficial differences, either, as Pauline mentioned earlier, uniquely allow us to serve different functions or bring different things to the table socially, or they provide a argument that's pretty powerful against meaningless or trivial differentiations. But Richard might say something different. I mean, because Richard is saying, I think that he says he thinks that we're spirit. And so, maybe his argument is that the speciation doesn't matter as much as the existence of a spirit that humans share. Yeah. Richard, one thing I'd be curious about, and I actually want to know about this from Oleg and Patrick too. It's going a little bit off field, but it's not really. It's only superficially going off field. Do we think animals have spirits?
I'm going to have Patrick go with that one to begin with.
Well, I was kind of on the we are one thing,
and answer it then, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was sort of piggybacking off what you said, Scott, which was, the genetic difference between us and chimpanzees is something like 2%. So when you think about the genetic difference between a man and a woman, or someone of color, someone who's different ethnicities, is so minute that to treat someone differently in a negative way, in particular, based on that minute difference, seems so ridiculous. So that's the way I look at it, is that it is literally, it's nothing. Do animals have spirits? I guess based on my percentages, they probably have some, right? If we're 98% chimpanzee, then there must be some spirit in there, I guess. I think so. I think definitely. I think dog lovers would tell you that animals have spirits. People who have domesticated animals in particular. So I think, I'd like to believe that. What's the alternative? To think they don't and just say, oh no, they're just fellow passengers to the grave. I don't know. I think it's nice to think that they have spirits.
Also, I think, how would you be able to explain some of the communication that takes place where I know this happens a lot with my dog. I don't even have to say certain things, where the presence alone can communicate the message. The presence of me walking into a room, and then the presence of me walking out of that room, or going towards a bowl that looks like full of treats. Now, I'm not telling him where I'm going, but yet he's able to sense directly.
Yeah.
So I think there probably is an element of spirit or higher form, higher energy, whichever way you want to look at it. But I will say that this whole concept of being able to communicate with my dog through thoughts has happened on numerous occasions. And yet both of us have felt that we've been able to understand each other in that moment without having to use the spoken word as a form of communication.
Richard's point, I believe, probably inadvertently goes as to this. He says in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, the word one is the word spirit is one. It is a way of life. And I'm going to take this, Richard, as the spirit that we have, or what makes us one, is that we share as human beings certain broad ways of life.
Mm-hmm.
And that animals don't have. And that being said, though, what you just said, Oleg, goes as to that question.
Yeah.
Because certain animals, particularly domesticated ones, are actually even animals that are not domesticated, but that are in close association with us. Rats.
Mm-hmm.
That probably would go extinct from what I've read if humans disappeared. Are walking our way of life, maybe slightly different paths, and to various degrees of closeness or not, but they're on the path with us. And the reason why I think that animals are germane to this, and whether they have spirits or not, because it goes as to what extent what we call humanity, or the rights, privileges, and empathy that we share with other human beings, what are the outer parameters of that? Does it extend to animals? And if so, what order of animals? If it doesn't extend, and does it gradually grade out as we go to animals? And then if it's a gradual grade out to animals, then is the arbitrary speciation at border at which we indisputably apply spiritual concepts, empathy concepts, legal concepts, things like those, are those things that are themselves arbitrary.
I will also say this is something to Richard's point, right? And maybe this is a way summarizes part of the conversation that we've had today. Definitely not the whole thing, because I mean, to count down the number of different topics we've gone through, it would, the time and the words wouldn't do it justice. But I will say this, that this whole concept of it is a way of life, which I think that's a key component for me that I'm choosing to walk away with. And that is understanding that any one perspective is just one way to live a life. It's not the way. And I think the same exact thing applies to many of the populations, and as well as people like us, because there are situations where we might be seen through the lens of disabled, or don't have certain things, don't have certain privileges. And I think that the understanding that I'm choosing to take away from much of this is that at the end of the day, any human being, or any being that is able to experience life, all it is at the end of the day, it's just one way of living. It's not the way. And that alone, I think, helps me somewhat eliminate the comparison aspect of it all, saying that this one's better, I'm worse, or I'm better, or this one's worse, but more so just accepting the fact that, okay, this person may not be able to do certain things that I am, but at the same time, the other one is also true. I can't do the same things that the other person is able to do. And so to what degree does this whole concept of life has to be lived through the way is even valid.
Patrick, we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask if you want to have the last soliloquy before we close out.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. It's been a real great chat. And thanks to everyone listening as well and inputting. For me, I think I've been left with a good conversation. To me, ends with more questions than answers. And I'm probably left with more questions. So we'll have to carry this on another time. But yeah, thank you guys so much. I think, Oleg, you really summed it up well there when you kind of alluded to the lens of which we all view our own realities, and we can get stuck in them. And I think the awareness of that and how we are and how we see the world and how we may be different to others and where our skills are and what those even mean. I think the awareness of that lens and the story we tell ourselves about who we are and who other people are, that's the key. If we can all be aware of that, then we can really live true kind of positive and self-aware lives and be, kind to one another. I think that's the key thing. So yeah, like I said, I have more questions than answers. It's been really fun. My brain is like wired, but also exhausted. You guys are unbelievable. And so thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Tim. That was a lovely remark to close out. Thank you so much for joining us. Melody, it is good to see you as always. Thank you for being in the house. Richard, we cannot imagine a show without you, and it's always a little bit sad when you're gone. And Pauline, Veronica, it was so good to have you here as well. Oleg, before we go, if you all like this conversation, Oleg is the king of these sorts of conversations. I will admit my own lack of ability compared to his. Oleg, tell us about where people can hear more conversations of this sort in your bailiwick.
I think for me, it comes down to two different shows. One of them that I'll be able to show here at the bottom, it's called the Overcoming Outs podcast. And really what that is just about, it's creating a space for people to be able to come as they are and share the different adversities. One other thing that I've recently started called a show called The Power of Your Story. And part of that really is about creating a space for people to share their stories, learn from their stories, and ultimately empower others through their stories. I'm a huge believer in that. I think if there's anything in my life that made a difference, it was realizing and understanding the power of one's individual narrative and how that forms a trajectory in the path moving forward. And I know, Scott, you have a similar platform as well, don't you?
Exactly. I have a weekly podcast called Scott Mason's Purpose Highway. Patrick has sat in the front seat, actually, as have you, Oleg, and taken a total drive with me down that road. We are attempting there to create a space for people to discuss connection with their higher purpose, to build a better self and a better world. And one of the things I love so dearly about both of you all is that you are not constantly just building a better self, but you are building a better world. And I thank you all for that. So you've seen the URL below. Patrick, why don't you, actually, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about you, Patrick, then I'll let you finish. You'll let me just talk about you, and then you'll talk a little bit more.
You'll do it.
Patrick is, as he mentioned earlier, the owner of a silk screen printing company, and he'll tell you a little bit more about that and how to reach him and that company there. But I will say the quality of their work is excellent. If you or anyone that you know is looking to have a t-shirt design printed for your company, for a birthday party, for a special event, for anything, please, please, please look up Patrick's company and take your business to them, because you're really not only getting great products, and their products alone are the selling point, really, but at the end of the day, you are helping to make the world a better place. I've experienced it and I've seen that work. Patrick, tell us a little bit more.
Thanks so much, Scott. we always say that with every order, every new customer, every new thing, we're able to open our doors that much wider to this population. So that's really what it is. It's so much more than a t-shirt, a pen, a mug. These things can really change people's lives. And it's, as Scott said, we're proud that it's a great product, and be proud that you're supporting that, and really helping, change someone's future and their outcome. So yeah, find us at spectrumdesigns.org. We would love to work with people who've been listening to this. We really are passionate about what we do, and help us make that change.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
I mean, I want to say just outside of that is it's been a true honor to share this space with both of you, as I think many of the other people, Richard and everyone else that chose to be a part of this. I will say that every single Thursday when these conversations take place, I always walk away a better person. And what I mean by better is someone who walks away with an expanded perspective on topics that I never thought about, or I never thought about through a particular lens before. And I think if anything that I've learned, it's that sometimes a conversation starts with one nut, so to speak, and then that thing cracks and it shatters into pieces, and then each piece becomes its own subtopic of it all. But I think the beauty of it all is that towards the end, it finds its way home, and we're able to connect and find that thing that actually started the conversation to begin with.
With that in mind, we will see everybody next week.